And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this cold, sunny day from across the Louisiana plain, where we are advancing the cause of constitutional conservatism and liberty in the state of Louisiana, raising the voice of constitutional conservative candidates and leaders, and slowly but surely draining the Louisiana swamp. My name is Chris.
And I'm Danielle, and this is the State of Freedom, brought to you by freedom-loving Louisiana First Patriots. Hello, State of Freedom warriors. Thank you for having us along for part of your day today, wherever your day is taking you. We are so grateful for you. You are the absolute best listening family anyone could possibly hope for, and we're only here because of your encouragement, your prayers, and your financial support. If you are looking for a way to support us, to advertise with us, or to send us feedback, please visit our website at freedomstate.us. We would really also appreciate it if you'd help get the word out about the State of Freedom. Like the show on whatever platform you listen to us, subscribe and share it. You can share short clips instead of full episodes from our YouTube and Rumble channels, and the links to those are always in the show notes and over on freedomstate.us. Well, today we have Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller joining us again. This time we'll touch on the border situation and states' rights, but really spend the thrust of our time talking about the very real threats we're facing nationwide to our electrical infrastructure. So we're really looking forward to talking to him. But first, let me read the scripture of the day. Today's passage is in Psalm chapter 69, and that psalm is called a cry of distress. And it picks up where David is praying to the Lord about his enemies. And it says, "Let their own table with all its abundance and luxury become a snare to them. And when they are secure in peace or at their sacrificial feasts, let it become a trap to them. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually from terror, dismay, and feebleness. Pour out your indignation upon them, and let the fierceness of your burning anger catch up with them. Let their habitation and their encampment be a desolation. Let no one dwell in their tents. For the Lord hears the poor and needy and despises not his prisoners, his miserable and his wounded ones. Let heaven and earth praise him, the seas and everything that moves in them. For God will save Zion and rebuild the cities of Judah. And his servants shall remain and dwell there and have it in their possession. The children of his servants shall inherit it, and those who love his name shall dwell in it." And the more we look into what's going on in our country, especially the border situation, the more we have to think that this is some kind of willful act by our enemies to destroy our way of life and our country. But God is still on his throne. He still hears the cries of his people, and he sees the horrors of what is really happening there. And as you hear reports, make it a priority to pray for a righteous resolution to the border crisis. Pray for justice and for the Lord to bring a stop to this planned and orchestrated invasion of illegal migrants. Many times in the Bible, the Lord talks about the importance of national boundaries and commands us not to move the ancient boundary lines. He hasn't stopped caring about them. And he also instructs us to pray for our enemies. We know that no one is so far gone that the Lord can't reach them. So pray that we would see many who are in the cartels and involved in other aspects of this evil effort converted to Christ in Saul of Tarsus moments. It's the Lord's will that none should perish, but all should have everlasting life. It's also not the will of the Lord for us to be overrun by our enemies. And I just really love verses 35 and 36. So I'll just encourage us to be decreeing those verses over our nation. For God will save Zion and rebuild the cities of Judah, and his servants shall remain and dwell there and have it in their possession. The children of his servants shall inherit it, and those who love his name shall dwell in it. This is God's promise to us.
It is indeed his promise to us, and God is always faithful to his promises, despite what the situation may look like currently. But you're right, Danielle, nobody is beyond redemption, not even our enemies, and we're supposed to pray for our enemies, but we're not supposed to be overrun. That is a fact. And we have, as you said, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller on us to talk first for a few minutes about the situation at the border and what is his thoughts are on the best way to go about resolving this. Lieutenant Colonel Waller, it's a pleasure to have you with us on again. How are you?
Hey, good. Thanks, Danielle and Chris, for having me on, and of course, thank you for covering this really important topic. If a nation cannot secure its borders, then what kind of nation is it? It's what kind of home do you have if you can't lock your door or keep intruders off your property? It's self-defense, and unfortunately, yeah.
It is indeed self-defense. What are your specific thoughts on what you've seen? I know that you are following it very closely. And what do you think we need to be doing right now to bring this matter to a successful conclusion?
Well, as we look at it, what you can see is that, number one, it's a fixable problem, right? We're going to talk in a little while about the grid, which is another fixable problem. But it doesn't appear as though the federal government intends to fix it. In fact, it seems as though it's quite the opposite, at least from the very top. That's not to say that there aren't just thousands of patriotic government employees that are working as hard as they can at various levels of the government to address the insecurity of the border. If you think about the agents that put their lives at risk every day, trying desperately to stop those cartels that you mentioned. That's not who I'm talking about when I say the, quote, government. Who I'm talking about is those at the very top that appear to be doing at each turn what they can to prevent that border from being secure. We saw on numerous occasions, Governor Abbott, even providing hand delivering a letter last year to President Biden about this, and recently yet another very strongly worded letter about his duty, his legal duty as a governor to protect his state. And then, you see the response of the Biden administration it appears to try to undo those things that a governor is doing, and so it just has to make you wonder what is the intent of the Biden administration when it comes to allowing so many people. I mean, the numbers are staggering. I compare it to an invasion. The entire United States Marine Corps, right? That's where I served. It's varied between 175,000 to, at its height, about 202,000 strong. We have close to 300,000, sometimes over that amount, of people coming through our border every month. That's bigger than the United States Marine Corps on a monthly basis every single month. And many of them are unaccompanied military-age males. So that's an invasion.
Yeah, Lieutenant Waller, that is almost, you're looking, based on the calculations that you just cited, we're looking at between 3.5 and 4 million illegal immigrants coming into the United States every year now, that is twice the size of the city of Philadelphia. I mean, think about it. I mean, this is a massive quantity. Do we know? We don't really know who these people are, do we?
No, not at all. I mean, and tens of thousands of them are Chinese nationals. I mean, years ago, it was difficult for a Chinese national to be permitted into this country illegally. Now they're flooding through the border. We know that the Chinese Communist Party seeks our destruction as really one of the last obstacles to that communist dictatorship really seizing power globally. And its people are pouring across that border. And that's just one hostile nation, not to mention, the dozens and dozens of, jihadis that are, or terrorists, people who are on the, quote, terrorist watch list that the federal government maintains. And so a very unfortunate circumstance here where at the very highest levels of the U.S. federal government, particularly in the executive branch, there is an unwillingness to secure that border. And, I have to commend the state governors that are doing their best to fill that gap.
Yeah. What would you say if you were advising Jeff Landry, what would you say to him that he should be doing to protect us as citizens of Louisiana, pretty close to the border? I see that Greg Abbott has stood up, and we saw that last week a number, I think over 20 governors stood up in support of Texas, including Louisiana through Governor Landry. Do you have any advice for him?
Yeah, Governor Landry's been great on this, very proactive. Governor Abbott, I mean, I have with me a copy of the U.S. Constitution I keep with me all the time. And when I had the opportunity to meet and brief Governor Abbott on a few topics, but including the grid, I thanked him for protecting his own National Guard members from the vaccine mandate, which was, of course, the subject of our last interview. I asked him to sign this copy of the Constitution. And, he took the time to flip through it, and he found the 10th Amendment, and he signed his name just above it. And that's what says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so in this case, the border should be defended by the federal government. And because the federal government is not doing it, thankfully, Governor Abbott and now Governor Landry, alongside him and many others are taking to the duties and responsibilities they have in that 10th Amendment, where they are taking their authority and applying it to the protection of the border. Now, with respect to Governor Landry, what kind of advice? It'd be a couple things. It would be to make sure that his own adjutant general, so the general officer that's in charge of the Louisiana National Guard, would be working alongside that of the other states to lobby the National Guard Association to do the right thing, right? So the National Guard has its own association and its own bureau up in Washington, D.C. Those officers and civilians that work at that bureau need to be on the right side of this, right? On the side of the people and the defense of our country and our border and border security. And so that's one thing. Secondly, and this is something that, I'm not going to talk too much about it today because we're still in the process of working the research and the analysis to put together a report on this, but that's the state guard. Technically, if our governors were to mobilize the National Guard under their own authority, which there is authority that states can use to mobilize the National Guard, it is technically and legally possible for Biden to federalize those Guard members to keep them from being used by the governor, right? And so, and this is something, if you guys, as your listeners, if they want to read about it, one of our team members, Kyle Scheidler, published a really good article, in fact, just today, at the Blaze, Blaze Media. It's also on our website, so centerforsecuritypolicy.org. And the title is, Can Joe Biden Federalize the National Guard to Stop Greg Abbott? And that article goes through all of the actual legal nuances involved. But when you look at the Biden administration and their actions, one wouldn't put it past them to do such a thing so far.
Yes. Well, especially if they actually have a desire to continue to facilitate what really is an invasion. If this is just a matter of incompetence, then I would guess the likelihood that they would federalize the National Guard to prevent it from acting would be less. But if they actually are deliberately acting and their objective is to facilitate this, then I think the chances of them federalizing the National Guard are very, very high. And what would happen then? Would the states be left completely defenseless at that point, or are there other options that they would have?
Well, that question, Chris, goes right into the reason why we've been doing this research on the state guard, right? States can form their own guard or militia, whatever you want to call it. Each state has, there are 22 states that have such a thing. Florida, under Governor DeSantis, recently really revamped its Florida State Guard. But that's the next level is, okay, if the forces that you have in your state you cannot count on to help your state because, the federal government is using them. And look, the origin of the state guards went back to World War II, where the able-bodied National Guard was having to be employed in the defense of our country in a global conflict. And so it's prudent to have such a state guard. And so that's part of what we are doing, is analyzing this in such a way that once we publish the report, we can hand it to people like Governor Landry and say, here's what you should know about what other states have done and what could be done in your state. for example. So that would be one thing, is to start to look at the capabilities that could be built at the state level, at which the federal government has no legal authority to interfere with. And, that's, like I said, Governor DeSantis was proactive about it in Florida, and in fact, even specifically said, look, I'm creating a landing spot for all the service members who are being kicked out of the U.S. military over this vaccine mandate. I mean,
That was brilliant.
I personally know some of the most incredible, capable, in this case, Force Recon Marines, who their careers were ended over that vaccine mandate, in some cases in worse circumstances than my own. And now they work for Governor DeSantis in the Florida State Guard. And they are some of the most highly capable people out there, right? Well, there's no reason why every other governor who wants to do their duty to their people and to the U.S. Constitution could not begin to assemble such things there. So probably something for a future, in terms of the details, for a future interview, because again, we're still working on this topic. But that would be my suggestion, is start looking at every asset you have at the state level if you weren't going to be able to count on the federal government.
Yeah. Last question on this, and then we're going to move on to the electric grids. But I'm very curious about your opinion on this. From what I'm reading, from what I've heard, there are thousands and thousands of truckers from Canada and perhaps other parts of the world, and even the United States, that are descending upon the Texas border. Thousands and thousands of them. What are your thoughts on that, and what do they hope to achieve by being there?
Yeah, so a friend of mine, Lieutenant Colonel Pete Chambers, is the one that made me aware of this. He is, in fact, one of the primary whistleblowers over the Biden administration's vaccine mandate in the military. He's a Special Forces doctor, and was one that was, unfortunately treated very negatively once he started to actually give what's called an informed consent brief about the risks associated with that. So he's a truth teller. And he made me aware about this this convoy headed to the border, where essentially we, the people, so to speak, are going to help. And I think a couple things. So one, it shows that there's still, the heart of the nation is still good. It's patriotic. There are many people who are willing to help and to serve, and those are the kind of people that are going to be headed there. I'm assuming, right? I'm sure it will probably enhance the morale of the people whose job it is, right? Like we talked before about the thousands of federal agents that are down there struggling to keep the border secure, the National Guard members from various states, and especially Texas, that are working to do the same. When they see we the people are behind them, I mean, what an inspiration, right? So that should be very, very inspirational to them. I also think that it's going to be supremely important that anyone involved is very, very careful at how and what they do. And we saw when many people went to Washington D.C. after seeing really worrisome issues of election integrity with the 2020 election, how many of them were seemingly drawn into what appears really to have been a pre-planned op, if you want to call it that.
You're correct.
Right. And so that would be something I think would be prudent for people to think about. Hey, can you provide inspiration and support and to those that are trying to secure this insecure border? Can you do it in a way that's legal, peaceful, and won't be somehow taken advantage of by someone who has a nefarious agenda? And I'm not saying that there is. I have no evidence of that. I'm just saying we've learned a lot in the last couple of years, So anyway, I don't know if that kind of answers the question, but
yeah, it does. It does. One thing we do know, it very much answers the question that they need to be. Obviously, their presence there could have great symbolic and psychological impact on the first responders who were there, and I could easily see that. I could also see, things getting out of control. And I know I said that was the last question, but I do need to ask you this, because we have a lot of people who are very interested in knowing this. we're in a situation, and it seems to be becoming more and more dramatic by the day, Tommy, where the state governments and the state powers that be are very much at cross purposes with top level officials in the Biden administration as far as what to do here and how to respond to this. And the criticism of deploying National Guard and other law enforcement on the border on the state level is that this could create some kind of an armed conflict between state government officials and the federal government. Is that a viable concern? And from a tactical standpoint and diplomatic standpoint, what needs to be done to avoid that?
Well, I think it would be a terrible consequence if something like that were to happen. The good thing is that the people, when you ask about the tactical level, the people who are working desperately to secure that border, both for the federal government employees and state government employees, this is just a professional judgment call. It's not that I, am in touch with these people every day and have spoken to them, but they're on the same side. They're on the same team. I think it's unlikely that you would see a situation where, there are people that want that for sure. There are people that would like. Let's look at, ultimately, this is a spiritual battle, right? We all know it's a spiritual battle. How does Satan work? Satan divides. He gets people to be divided over things and to fight each other, right? And so prayerfully, I would very much hope that those kind of people that are down there trying to provide security are cut from the same patriotic mold, and that they couldn't be convinced by people who would like to sow division and discord, whether spiritually or physically, to allow that to happen.
Yeah. And covering them in prayer, consistently and unceasingly, as St. Paul said, is so very, very important to do that. And we're going to continue to do that.
Yeah, and that's where, when Lieutenant Colonel Chambers reached out to me, as soon as the very first word came out about this convoy, that's exactly what he asked. I was at the airport about to board an airplane, saw his phone ring, answered it. He said, "Hey, I need you to get prayer intercessors to start praying." I said, "Okay, well, give me the 5 W's, boom," right? And so right now you literally have an organization, Intercessors for America, that has prayer warriors covering them with prayer right now. So yeah, Chris, you're exactly right. That's first and foremost.
That's amazing. And maybe just a mention there, we do have a chapter of Intercessors for America based in Louisiana. I think there's a chapter now in all 50 states. And I'll drop a link in the show notes so people can get involved with their calls. I think they have calls on Monday nights that, interceding for our state and the nation. So I love Intercessors for America.
A great organization.
So great. And Tommy, just to switch gears here, although I do want us to come back to this border issue sometime soon as your team has their report ready, because there's a lot that we want to cover there, and I think there's a lot we need to be aware of. Of course, there are new developments every day, but would love to get your insight once you guys feel like you have kind of a full scope of what's going on. But to switch gears, you have been raising alarm bells about the very real threats to America's electrical infrastructure. Can you tell us what you're seeing and how vulnerable is our grid?
Sure. Yeah, that's been a big part of my job at the Center for Security Policy for about a decade. The founder of our organization, Frank Gaffney, sat me down, like I said, almost 10 years ago and said, "Look, I need you to manage and lead our nationwide Secure the Grid coalition." And so this issue of the insecurity of the electric grid has been near and dear to my heart for that much time. And so the reality is that the grid is still, unfortunately, very vulnerable. We traditionally would talk about the threats to the grid. There are like 4 main threats. There's, I think, now 6, and so we can go through each one of those a little bit if you like. Unfortunately, the 6th one, if we can talk about it first, is not too dissimilar to the border situation, where the problems are self-induced, right? So we may suffer brownouts and blackouts in this country because of our own irrational federal government policies, and in some cases state governments as well, right? So when you see the shuttering of baseload power generators, nuclear plants and coal and fossil fuel plants that can produce large amounts of electricity, when you see those being shut down at the same time as you see a push to electrify everything, electric vehicles, electric transportation, physics doesn't allow these things to be electrified if you're not generating enough electricity.
It's
right?
complete
so that
insanity.
It's literally now one of the threats that we have to worry about is are we shutting down power generation faster than we are connecting the things to the grid, right? So that's one where unfortunately the Biden administration has not been helpful from our perspective, and thankfully there are many people at the state level are waking up to that. In fact, I was just speaking with one of the members of our coalition that mentioned, and I can't remember. I've been dealing with so many states, I don't remember which one it is, but they were talking about how the lawmakers said we're going to pass a bill that tells the utilities they cannot shut down a generation plant. They're prohibited from doing it until they can prove that they have a source of generation that can make up for it in the future, right? To try to avoid this self-induced. Many of them don't, right? But if they're required by law, then that could potentially help. And in many cases, the utilities don't want to shut those things down. It's the federal government's EPA restrictions and other things that are, or it's the false and artificial economic conditions that cause them to be shut down, where you have massive federal subsidies for generation such as wind and solar, and because of those subsidies, the utilities can't compete with other sources of generation that are much more resilient and are not intermittent, and so that's a situation where a state law might be able to help give the utility some ammunition to say, well, hey, I have to keep this going, right? So to whoever they have to tell it to, whether it's the EPA or maybe their own state public service commission. Anyway, it's a complicated issue, but yeah, we're seeing the potential for blackouts because of our own policies. But really, for the past 10 years, it was 5 other threat vectors that we were heavily focused on, and again, I'd be happy to kind of go through those with you.
Well, let me before we do that, I want to ask you about this, because this is a very intriguing quote that I read in an article that you were featured in on your website, and you said, when it comes to protecting America's electric grid, the U.S. government has been MIA for decades, and that's your quote. And my question, Tommy, is why is that the case? Why would our government, particularly the executive agencies in our government, not treat securing our electrical grids as a matter of top strategic priority?
Yeah, okay, Chris, well, a couple things. When we talk about decades, just to make sure your listeners understand that I'm not, full of bull here, May 1981 was the first report. Government Accountability Office published a report titled Federal Electrical Emergency Preparedness is Inadequate. That was 1981, right? And they talked about the fact that it's vulnerable to disruptions from acts of war, sabotage, or terrorism. And then the quote, is not now prepared, they're talking about the federal government, is not now prepared to handle a long-term national or regional disruption in electrical power. And that is still the case, right? So that's 4 decades. It's over 4 decades. And in fact, when it comes to physical sabotage, which they reference in that GAO report, the numbers are staggering and they are increasing. We've tracked the numbers, and when I say we, our nonprofit, the volunteers that we have, what we do is we analyze data provided by the utility industry to the federal government. The Department of Energy requires that anytime there's electrical disturbances, that the industry reports the reason, right? And so that data has been tracked since January 2010. And so when you go through, and they haven't updated it in the last 7 months. Unfortunately, it's only updated through June of last year. But the number of times when physical attack caused an electrical disturbance was 1,072. which is 42.8% of the time. Okay, the only thing higher is weather, and of course we would expect that weather would cause outages. But second only to weather, weather is 49.9%, physical attack 42.8%. That is over one per week, more than one per week around the country. Somewhere the grid is being attacked, and I would just ask your listeners to think about when they drive up and down the road, and they can see high voltage transformers. What sort of protection does it look like they have? In many cases, it's nothing, right? You may have walls protecting a neighborhood from the sound coming in off of an interstate, but then the transformer substation that provides the lifeblood to that neighborhood is largely unguarded.
So true.
That's just physical.
Wow. Yeah, that's really kind of frightening when you think about it.
Well, and you've said physical threat, and maybe you'll get to this, Tommy, but is there a cyber threat as well? Or are you seeing attacks that way?
Yeah, I'll just name the threat vectors real quick, right? So of course, we talked before about weather, Mother Nature, right? So of course you have terrestrial weather and hurricanes, which you could also, when you say Mother Nature, you can include things like tree branches and squirrels and all these.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the Great Northeast Blackout, August 14th, 2003, put 55 million customers without power, some for up to 2 weeks. That was a tree branch, right? That was wild. A cascading failure because tree branches connected with transmission lines up in Ohio, and massive blackout, right? And let me just say before I list the rest of the threat vectors, do you know how long it took the federal government to create and enforce a standard for vegetation management for cutting of trees? Can you guess how long it took?
No idea.
How long?
9.5 years.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God.
We could have won World War II twice in the time it took the U.S. federal government to create and enforce a standard for vegetation management. And do you know to this day?
After that blackout. After that blackout.
That's right. And to this day, if you're an electric utility that does violate vegetation management standards or any of the critical infrastructure protection standards, which we'll talk about for cyber and physical attack, if you violate those standards that the industry themselves create, the public doesn't even get to know your identity. That's how much the government covers for the industry when it comes to allowing them to run the show. So that's when we talk about Mother Nature, you got terrestrial weather, you got things like trees and hurricanes. We're going to talk about solar weather in a minute, but then you have, of course, human attack. We talked about physical sabotage just a moment ago, right? And that can be anything from, I don't really want to talk too much about the various methods by which you can take substations down, but let's just say physical sabotage. Cyber attack, of course, as you asked, Danielle, that happens every day. Thousands and thousands of attempts via the cyber domain to attack our electric utility industry. We saw the Russians do it in the Ukraine, and the same malware that was installed in Ukraine we know exists in the United States in our energy sector. One of the variables of cyber, but it's related to cyber, but it is its own standalone threat vector, and this is a new one, is supply chain. Right? Depending on where we are purchasing the components that go into our grid, we know, for example, right now, that there are over 430 large transformers manufactured in China currently in our grid. We know at least one of those was found to have a hardware backdoor in it that would allow someone to remotely manipulate it. That's a problem.
That's
right?
A big problem.
The supply chain. It's a huge problem, right? And so it's something that we've been addressing. So you got physical, you got cyber, you got supply chain. Then you have electromagnetic spectrum, using the electromagnetic spectrum, right? And that can be done at a localized level, the radio frequency weapon, something that can produce a localized pulse of electromagnetic energy. You see some of this sometimes in movies, where they might, I think it's Ocean's 11 or something, they use this, radio frequency weapon to take the power down. But it can be done on a wide scale with a nuclear weapon in the exo-atmosphere. It's called nuclear high altitude electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. So that's another way that humans can do it. And finally, the natural form of EMP, which is solar weather. The sun can produce these coronal mass ejections. People call it a solar flare. It's not the flare. You might see the flare. But behind it is this coronal mass ejection, this huge blast of highly magnetized particles in space. And it happens all the time, and sun blasts these out into space all the time. But when they connect with Earth and our magnetosphere, it can have a catastrophic effect on electric infrastructure. And so it's a natural form, very similar to nuclear EMP, one component of nuclear EMP, and it is 100% going to happen at some point. We don't know when, but the sun produces these all the time, and at some point the Earth will connect with that coronal mass ejection. And I'd be happy to explain, because it is kind of interesting, I'd be happy to explain the phenomenon, how exactly that works, what happens, what we've been doing about it, and what the government hasn't been doing to address it.
I'd love to hear about it, because I've been hearing things about solar flares for the last few years as a threat, but I haven't really been able to wrap my brain around what that looks like and what it means for us.
Sure. Well, yeah, let me just explain then, right? So the Earth has a magnetosphere, and anytime you have that magnetosphere and there's movement generated in that magnetosphere, it can generate electromagnetic energy or electricity. So let's think about like when you start your lawnmower, for example, you pull start it. You've got a magnetosphere in there with that magnet and copper wire, and when you pull the cord, the movement of that creates electromagnetic energy, right? And it travels down a wire to your spark plug, and it starts your engine. Well, the Earth's magnetosphere, when it's struck by a massive coronal, mass ejection, or in the case of a nuclear blast out in space, 30 kilometers or higher, it causes the magnetosphere of the Earth to heave and move and wobble, and that movement generates electromagnetic energy, and it travels through the crust of the Earth. And then you think about, what does electricity do? It always looks for the path of least resistance, right? So imagine that the Earth, of course, is conductive. The Earth's crust is conductive. It has different conductivity in different areas, right? And so traditionally, the northern latitudes, the composition of the soil and the fact that they are further north and closer to the sun in most cases, they could be affected worse than many southern states. However, there's something called the coastal effect. You think about the salt water along the Louisiana coastline, for example, is highly conductive. So you think about this electromagnetic energy induced by this coronal mass ejection hitting our Earth's magnetosphere. It starts to travel through the crust of the Earth. Well, what's it looking for? It's looking for a path of least resistance. And what it finds are these long transmission lines, these long conductors, right? So a geomagnetic disturbance caused by the sun, or the E3 component of a nuclear EMP, is going to couple that electromagnetic energy from the Earth. It's called a ground-induced current. That ground-induced current is going to couple with those long transmission lines and induce a current into them that travels down them to whatever they're attached to. And what they're attached to are gigantic, almost irreplaceable transformers, right? These are the backbone of the existing grid. These transformers are needed to be able to step up a voltage, to let that voltage travel over long distances to where it's going, and then they have to be stepped down again and then distributed to the industry and the people. Those transformers, the lead times for them right now are 4 to 6 years, and most of them are made overseas. And those ground-induced currents can catastrophically ruin those transformers. And so that's something that...
Oh, gosh.
And if that were to occur, you're talking about a situation where we could be waiting 4 to 6 years for transformers?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's almost unthinkable, right? And it's not that the federal government doesn't know this. Look, I personally briefed the Secretary of Energy twice on this. And here's the thing. It's a fixable problem. I mean, for the neutral ground blockers, the type of technology that exists, that has been tested by the federal government in its national laboratories, the cost nationwide for the most vulnerable transformers is just over $4 billion with a B. That's 1/3 of 1% of the Biden infrastructure bill, which I personally told Secretary Granholm twice.
Wow.
And yet I've seen no action by the federal government.
Not to mention the percentage of the money that's been sent to Ukraine and other places that is not protecting us.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you could find all sorts of comparisons for money that we've sent elsewhere or to do other things that could have been spent on protecting the one thing we can't live without. And thus far, unfortunately, it hasn't happened at the federal level. We're going to continue to sound the alarm at the federal level with this. I mean, it's much like Ezekiel chapter 33, the duty of the watchman on the wall. That is our duty, and it is helpful sometimes when you're briefing a state official. Right, when I had the opportunity to sit down with Governor Abbott and brief him on this particular threat, I was able to show him the same stuff we briefed Secretary Granholm, and answer his questions about, well, what did she say? What did she do? Well, she just smiled, gave us a thumbs up through her mask. It was a virtual briefing, interestingly enough, but she hasn't actually done anything, right? And so it's helpful to have the ability to tell people at the state level, look, it's not that the federal government doesn't know. They've been briefed. They're not doing it. It's up to you. And of course, that's something I'm hoping over the coming year with a new governor, that Louisiana will be able to more aggressively address. We look at these threats, including nuclear EMP. We didn't get into all the details of how that works, but it's got a similar, and in some cases even worse effect on the grid as solar weather. But May 2016, we arranged for the world's foremost experts to fly to Louisiana to brief Governor John Bel Edwards. He was briefed. He didn't do anything. Right, and so the good thing is we got a new person in charge from the executive branch, and I do think it's something we need to explore. The state of Louisiana should explore with its legislature, and the good thing too is there are some members of the Public Service Commission that have been pretty solid on various threats, and so it's something that does have to be addressed at the state level.
And Tommy, you mentioned Secretary Granholm and John Bel Edwards. Their complete inaction and unwillingness to do anything to protect the people of the state and the nation. Do you have a sense, are they protecting themselves, do you imagine? Or do you think, when they just don't really care about the rest of us, or they are not taking it very seriously? Do you have a sense on that?
So it's multifaceted, right? Yeah, and everybody's motivation, I can't speak to the fact that those two would necessarily have the same motivation. I think for Secretary Granholm, a lot of it is ideological, and it's that kind of irrational progressive thought. Like the progressive movements essentially says, oh, we can solve all of the world's problems. And, in many cases, like if we just, throw enough money and quote experts at it, things that seem to be impossible we can do, like irrational thought. And so that's that quote expert class that the progressives, have insinuated into our country. And so I think for someone like Granholm, that could be the case. A lot of times when it comes to elected officials, a lot of it has to do with who's paying into their campaigns, right? And so the electric power industry spends a lot of money lobbying around the country. At the federal level alone, it's roughly $148 million per year in lobbying and political influence at the federal level. At the state level, it all depends which state, but it's a ton of money. And, you think about every elected official has electric utilities that provide power where they do their job. And those utilities have many, many lobbyists, and those lobbyists are very good at what they do. And, at the end of the day, what we really need to have is the utility industry themselves need to just admit that they've got a problem, that they're vulnerable to these various threats, and then that the people would pay extra to have it fixed. A lot of times it's all about cost, right? And so the utility industry will lobby against certain forms of legislation. I can tell you some stories in Texas that would be a good case study, but they'll lobby against it. And in fact, it could actually be something that, if wisely done, they can make just as much or more money doing the right thing if the protections are just built in to our rates, right? And they're given the ability to recover those costs.
Yeah. And ultimately, obviously, we all have a very powerful vested interest in making sure that our grid system is secure and invulnerable from attacks, whether they be physical attacks, cyber attacks, or any other kind of attack. It seems like this is the kind of thing, again, that's staring us straight in the face, and yet we are, state and federal officials simply are not doing what they need to do to resolve the problem. And one thing that you've made very clear today, Tommy, is that they cannot plead ignorance, because you and others have been very, very clear on both the nature and the magnitude of this threat.
That's right. Yeah, and like I said, we could actually do hours and hours about this because it is so gigantic. It is, and there's such a history of it, in terms of, unfortunately, in some cases, the electric power industry funding certain studies that try to sort of wish away some of these threats as though they're not real. We've, along the way, done everything we can to be able to provide the facts and the truth. One of the things I would encourage, because I know we're, cognizant of your listeners' time, is just to know it is a fixable problem. Even if sometimes the legislation fails, it doesn't mean it's not going to help solve the problem. So I'll just tell you a short story about Texas, and then make sure before we finish that I give you some information about a documentary film that people can watch, in a way for them to get involved.
Great.
So how much time do we have?
As much as you have.
Okay. So in Texas has its own grid, right? And so when the founder of our organization, Frank Gaffney, sat me down and said, hey, you're going to run this Secure the Grid Coalition, you need to focus first on Texas because it has its own grid. And so that's where I went, right? And really, by God's providence, had the ability to meet. It's a great little story. I'll share just a part of it. We brought in Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who unfortunately has since passed away, but very knowledgeable about the threat of electromagnetic pulse, for example. And I said, look, Dr. Pry, I need you to go to Texas with me. So what's your plan, Tommy? I said, look, I don't know anybody yet in Texas. I don't have a plan. I've been praying about it. Just trust me, we're going to go during this inauguration of this new governor, Governor Abbott, right? So there's bound to be somebody there who we can talk to about this. This is years ago, probably 9 years ago. And so I pick him up from the airport. He's actually like, hey, Tommy, what's the plan? Dr. Pry, I've been praying about it. I don't have a plan necessarily yet because I still don't know anybody, but we're going to meet him. Now he's kind of getting pissed. He's like, I mean, you're going to waste my time flying me into Austin. And so we go to the inauguration, and then we're walking into the Capitol, and Dr. Pry's kind of aggravated at me, and I can't blame him. I mean, gosh, I should have a plan, but sometimes you just got to go do recon. You don't know what, you just got to get on the objective and figure it out, And
Absolutely.
So the elevator doors open up, and there's a gentleman standing there, and he introduces himself, and he says, hey, I'm newly elected senator here in Texas. Who are you? Well, and Tommy Waller, Dr. Peter Pry, and might sound crazy, but we're here to talk to anybody who will listen about something called electromagnetic pulse and what it can do to your Texas grid. And this gentleman stops and says, you're talking about HEMP, high altitude nuclear electromagnetic pulse? And of course, Dr. Pry lights up like, oh my gosh, who even uses that acronym? And he said, that's incredible. He said, it was my job as a young Air Force captain to harden the Minuteman II missile system against EMP. I was in charge of, that project. And Dr. Pry's eyes are huge. He says, you know this scientist and this scientist, and like, oh yeah, they're going back and forth. And Dr. Pry looks over at me. I said, I told you I was praying. So I share that story because, I share that story because the power of prayer. And here's the second part of the story. Senator Hall sponsored a bill that year on EMP and the grid, right? And that bill failed. And in fact, his bill has failed every single year, every single session. The utility lobby defeats it every single time. But guess what? What that did is it inspired one of the utilities in Texas, CenterPoint Energy, to have its engineers start to figure out technological solutions to that threat. And now CenterPoint has a substation protection system that can protect against nuclear EMP that costs 25% of what a normal substation would in terms of the relay house. It's 25% of the normal cost. And it's been tested, and so this is a success story that because the lawmaker was trying desperately to address it, even though his bill failed, it inspired the industry to create something. And right now we're told, and I don't have it on paper yet, but was recently told, that company has managed to get the Texas Public Service Commission to allow cost recovery, to allow them essentially to put into the rate base the cost of outfitting every one of their substations with this technology. That's exactly what we need to happen.
Because one lawmaker had the courage to bring a bill, and even though it was not successful, look what it produced.
Right, and they see the people, right? The number of people that would come and testify and support every time. But I'm going to tell y'all, the best case scenario is if and when the utility industry becomes part of the solution, right? Because it's just such a powerful lobby. And so my prayer is that in every state you see the utility industry follow CenterPoint's lead and do what they're doing. And that's, of course, just one threat, right? That's EMP. I mean, there's 6 we talked about. But that I think is what would need to happen in every state around the country. It's a little more complicated because Texas has its own grid, right? Other states are connected to other states, so you have to figure out how to island if you're going to do just one state. But it's got to start somewhere, right? And so I'm glad that you guys are covering this, and your listeners can start to think about how they can get involved in really the call to action for the state of Louisiana to address this. And I'd be happy to talk about ways they can do that.
Please, and we'd love to know if there's a way for people to be personally prepared as well.
Sure. Now, I will say on the personal preparedness side, any ability for you to sort of think about, like, what do you do if the lights go out? How long do you have water, for example? Are you connected to the city if it loses water? I mean, the good thing is the residents of Louisiana are somewhat familiar with this just because of the natural disasters and hurricanes that the state faces all the time, right? So you think about hurricane preparedness, but without the preparatory phase. Okay, so when we know a storm's coming, we have time to prepare for it. Threats to the grid, you may have zero prep time. And so you look at like the residents of Moore County, North Carolina, Christmases ago in December, the lights just went out, right? Boom, no notice, because of a physical attack on 2 substations right outside of Fort Bragg. So you want to be prepared like a hurricane, except for longer duration without any notice whatsoever. Is I guess one thing I would say. As much as the people can be prepared, and especially the electric utility industry's people, right? Because their families need to be taken care of, our law enforcement, the people in every community who are responsible for helping a community through a disaster are the ones who are first and foremost, their families need to be the most prepared. And so preparation's absolutely important. And then fixing the problem and defending the infrastructure. And so, what I will tell you is that one of the things Dr. Pry said is, man, the more you learn about this, the more, it's very frightening, it's scary, the more it kind of just makes you want to run to the frontier. And what he said was that the founders of this country had an infinite frontier to run to, but they didn't. They turned and they fought tyranny, right? And so we need to fight the tyranny of inaction that's been the case with this particular threat. And one way that people can do that is getting smart on it and using a platform that we helped create. There's a new film, a documentary film, narrated by Dennis Quaid, that I had the privilege to help produce. And it's called Grid Down, Power Up. And so the first thing I would ask the viewers and listeners to do is to just go to YouTube and just type in Grid Down, Power Up documentary into the search engine. And that's going to help with the algorithms so that the more people who are searching for that, the more it's going to end up popping up for other viewers. So Grid Down, Power Up documentary, and they'll see a version that's an hour and 5 minutes long that was literally put on YouTube last week. That's something that people can watch. Secondly, they can actually get involved. When you go to griddownpowerup.com, the website for which this film was created, there's a participate tab. So you go to griddownpowerup.com and you hit participate, and you have various methods by which you can send pre-drafted letters to all the people in your state who have a duty to address this threat. That will begin to build the groundswell of awareness so that those who are in the utility industry, the regulators like the public service commissioners, state lawmakers will start to hear the people and know that, man, we've got to do something about this, right? And I do want to credit you have in Louisiana a public service commissioner who has been proactive on at least some of these. The supply chain and cyber threat Commissioner Eric
Skrmetta. Yeah, Eric Skrmetta. And unfortunately, I was shocked a year or so ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, Tommy, when it was something that he put forward that would have prohibited, and you know more about it than I do, but would have certainly made us less vulnerable to the sort of grid attacks from our enemies than we are right now. And unfortunately, some of the other public service commissioners opposed him. And I was like, what are you doing? This seems very straightforward.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right, Chris. That's what happened. Skrmetta had a really solid directive, basically, to prohibit foreign-produced devices that could be problematic for the grid. He was opposed by 3 of the other members of the commission. But you know what ended up happening is my colleague Christopher Holton wrote about it in local. It was run in some local media, and those commissioners reversed course, and they ended up coming in and supporting Commissioner Skrmetta. And so it's just kind of another good news story of, you know, when the people get involved and you know, in a very well-informed, articulate, and respectful manner, have their voices heard, it can make a difference. And so in that case,
absolutely can.
Yeah, and so we applaud you guys for using your podcast to do just that.
Well, we applaud you for being here with us and for educating not only us but all of our listeners on this issue. It's fascinating and it's also alarming.
It is. And Tommy, would you remind people how we can follow your work and support, and how our listeners can help support the Center for Security Policy as well?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Just, you know, as a reminder for your listeners, our organization is not funded by the government, by any foreign sources, by any company that could profit off of this. So I'll just tell you, like, I've had defense contractors that do work for EMP, for example, try to hand me a check, and they have no idea how much I need it, but I couldn't take it. I didn't take it. Because the moment anybody thinks that we're doing what we're doing, telling the truth about this because somebody's paying us, is when we lose their trust and respect. So the only way that we can do what we do is when patriotic Americans just donate to our nonprofit, right? And so the Center for Security Policy is the organization. Our website is securefreedom.org. And of course, that'll forward to our centerforsecuritypolicy.org. And there's you know, what I would suggest is on the website at the very bottom, you can subscribe to our daily brief, and you can get emails each day on a wide variety of topics that we cover down on. You can also subscribe to our founder's Secure Freedom Minute. So each day he does a 60-minute radio commentary on different matters. The border was primary among them this past week. So people can subscribe at the bottom there at securefreedom.org, and then you'll see a button if you feel compelled to help with donations. We certainly would appreciate them because that's the only way we can exist. So thank y'all for asking.
And thank you for the vital work that you're doing, Tommy. There is no more important work as far as we're concerned. And we will have you back on soon for another update. We're going to encourage our listeners to go to the website and support you in any and every way they can.
Awesome, Chris. We appreciate it, y'all.
Thanks, Tommy. We'll talk to you soon.
Have a great day.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye.
Chris, I feel like I've just been to school on this. I had no idea how vulnerable we were. I mean, you can think about some of the simple things, obviously the weather events we know and have lived through. It didn't really occur to me. I haven't really spent any time thinking that people might be shooting at transformers, but that's a little easier to understand than some of the EMPs and the solar flares that he was talking about. I just feel like he brought us to school, and I think that it's so encouraging that he is so like-minded with us, that he's not just a person who wants to get informed. He also gives us a plan of action. And so I will be encouraging our listeners, and I'll be going as well, to griddownpowerup.com and getting involved, seeing how we can help really just provide, like LCAG does, strengthen numbers behind people who want to do the right thing anyway.
Absolutely, it's a great call to action to go to the to that website, and as Tommy said, it increases the algorithm. The more people who go on there and do that and go into the search engine and type it, I agree with you, Danielle, that I'm alarmed, to be honest with you, by the magnitude of the threat and the vulnerability of our grid. I'm just as alarmed by that as I am right now by the threat on our border. Not that these things, but they're fixable. Tommy said several times that these things are fixable. It's just unfortunate that our current administration is not doing what it needs to do to secure either our border or our grid. And we have to continue to raise public awareness. I'm so glad Tommy is there. And at some point, we've got to get a new administration in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. That's basically it. I love what he said, how he described the state of apathy in our country as the tyranny of inaction. And while our listeners are activated and motivated, we all have people in our lives who we can see who are busy going about their day-to-day lives, kind of oblivious to the fact that the world is falling apart around them. But I do think people are waking up, Chris, and I do think that this border situation especially has really woken people up. I was watching kind of some coverage of the primary in New Hampshire, and there was kind of a man on the street kind of interview, and the guy was asking people what's your top, who are you voting for, and what are your reasons? And almost to a person, except for like say 3 or 4, they said they were voting for Trump because of the border and the economy. Those are the 2 reasons. People in New Hampshire voting because of the border. That means people are waking up.
Yes. The situation on the border now, Danielle, it reminds me to some degree of the imminent threat that the Nazis posed to Western civilization when Winston Churchill was the prime minister of Britain. And, they loved him when they actually were able to see, okay, this is an existential crisis. Our freedom and liberty are truly on the line here. And he was a hero at that point because they knew he was the only one who could come forward and do what needed to be done to solve the problems. And I really think that that's the way Trump is being viewed now, because they understand, look, maybe he has all these personal foibles, but we're talking about a fundamental crisis of our republic, and he's the only one who really has the strength or the capacity to solve it. And I really believe that that's the silver lining. It is really waking people up, this border crisis.
It is, and I'm still encouraging prayerful decrees about it, and prayer generally, because as standalone citizens who are maybe not members of the National Guard or the military, maybe there's not that much we can actually physically do. Perhaps there is that we can do to support people, but prayer is essential because, as Lieutenant Colonel Waller said, these are military-aged men crossing the border and just infiltrating our country. We have to be able to defend ourselves, and we have to get the border shut.
Absolutely. And the calls to action for today's show will definitely be there. And as Tommy mentioned, Danielle, this may be something, I put it in my notes during the show to look at that Texas legislation.
Yeah.
And to see if there's legislation similar here in Louisiana that we can promote to protect our grid here in Louisiana. And in order to do that, and in order to move forward and to be successful on these items, obviously we need continued support for LCAG. So we thank our supporters for LCAG who are helping us to continue to build our infrastructure. We encourage donations, encourage membership to LCAG at lacag.org. And checks also can be mailed to P.O. Box 64952, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 70896. We are your eyes and your ears and your voice in the legislature, and we will continue to be so, and we need and rely on your financial support. So please prayerfully donate and assist us in this great effort.
Yes, and if you'd like to continue to support the work that we're doing at the State of Freedom, you can do that at freedomstate.us. We would love to be able to continue to bring you great updates like today's update and powerful guests who really have a lot of insight into the issue areas that they are focused on. And so help us continue bringing great info over at freedomstate.us or at P.O. Box 861, Berg, Louisiana, 70343. And Chris, also, I can't let us go without mentioning for the listeners about Metal Stacks. It's a precious metals collectors club where you can buy metals at the best prices on the market, which is actual dealer cost. Metal Stacks is beating the big sites. They have no credit card fees and no minimums. So if you're interested in purchasing metals, you can visit metalstacks.com/dwalker. That helps me out. I'll get the commission. And if you're interested in starting a referral business through Metal Stacks, let me know. I can get you more info on that. Just drop me a line at Danielle at freedomstate.us.
Metal Stacks is a tremendous opportunity. I'm so glad to be participating in that with you and Katie, and I cannot wait to see where it leads. I want to join you in thanking our listeners and our subscribers to the State of Freedom, Danielle. Every day we're growing more and more listeners are subscribing and sharing and listening, obviously, to the State of Freedom. And the ultimate goal is to be the platform for conservative constitutional freedom in the state of Louisiana. And we are moving and becoming more and more expansive every day. We live in a day and an age where we're being censored left and right, and we must have a platform where the unvarnished, uncensored truth can be spoken. And that's why it is so important to support the State of Freedom, where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of listeners across Louisiana can listen and understand what is really going on. Knowledge and information really are power. And that's why the State of Freedom is so important. So please continue to share, and subscribe. And if we do that, Danielle, and if our listeners continue to do that and continue to support us, we will take each and every day another step to preserve the State of Freedom in Louisiana.
Amen. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the State of Freedom. To stay on top of all the calls to action we mentioned today, just check out the show notes for the episode. If you'd like to support the show financially, visit our website at freedomstate.us. If you'd prefer to give by mail, you can send a check to the State of Freedom, LLC, at P.O. Box 861, Berg, Louisiana, 70343. If you own a business in Louisiana and are interested in supporting our show by advertising, please email us at info@freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org, LACAG.org, or email Chris at chris@lacag.org. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and share it. Give us a 5-star rating in the reviews. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next time.